Well, good to see everybody here this morning. Happy New Year. This is our first Sunday of 2025. And if you're like me and Rebecca and a number of other people in our congregation, maybe you've started a 365-day Bible reading plan. And maybe it's a chronological reading plan as well. I know a number of you have downloaded an app, and so I thought it would be really fitting that since we're all in Genesis 1 or, in that area in this first week looking at Genesis, well, let's go ahead and start where the app starts. Let's go ahead and start where the Bible starts. It's very fitting that at the beginning of a new year that we should consider beginnings. So have your Bibles open to Genesis chapter 1. We're going to take a look at some things there in Genesis 1. I want to kind of do an overview of this chapter and then pull a lesson from it. From that lesson, we're actually going to talk about several different practical applications about what it means for us to face beginnings and to be a new creation shaped and made useful by God from material that was once formless and void. If you're reading Genesis 1 and you don't see yourself in that story, I think maybe you've missed the point of it. So let's go to Genesis chapter 1, and let's start where the Bible starts here in Genesis 1 and in verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Rebecca told me when she read that, she said, that'd be a really great beginning to a movie, wouldn't it? You know, it's kind of eerie. God creates everything, but He creates this raw material. It's formless, it's void. There's only darkness, like a lump of clay that hasn't been turned into anything yet, like a skein of yarn that has not become the creation of the crafter. We've just got dark, raw material at this point. It's formless and it's void, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. And so in verse 3, God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, one day. Genesis chapter 1 is not merely a step-by-step technical guide to God creating the raw materials of the universe. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't want anyone to misunderstand. God did create the raw materials of the universe. Every atom and every element and every photon in this entire universe, and even the void or vacuum of space between them, God created everything. But God didn't just create everything in a material sense. God also created everything to have function. In addition to the form, there was function, there's usefulness. Everything has a point behind it. God doesn't just make stuff and go like, well, I guess there's that thing now. God didn't make some material or some element. He was like, well, I guess we got uranium. I don't know what we're supposed to do with it, but we made uranium. No, there's also function behind everything. God takes what is formless and void and functionless and also orders it so that from chaos, there's no longer chaos. From disorder, there is now order. From uselessness, there is now usefulness. And I think that that's a really, really cool thing. In addition to the function, God also makes things aesthetic. He makes things beautiful. God looks at everything that He makes in the creation, and He says, oh, that's good. That's very good. The stars, ooh, that's good. That's good. He looks at the creatures, the animals, the beasts, the fish, and the birds. That's good. He takes a step back, proverbially speaking, of course, from His creation at the end of day 6, and in verse 31 of chapter 1, He says, this is very good, what I have created. The creation account, as I'm alluding to, is less of a blueprint of physical structures, right? In Genesis 1, we're not told how God made the light. We're not told what the process was when God made the animals. And again, don't misread or misunderstand me. I'm not trying to shove something into Genesis 1. There's no ulterior motive here. But we're not told what that process was like. And we're not really told exactly what the structure of the universe or the world was before the flood. Right? There's a lot of mystery here in Genesis 1 about when God made this, what did actually he, how did he put it together? It's less of a blueprint for those things and more of an explanation of when God does make something and make everything he certainly does, he makes it with a purpose and there's a point to it. Unlike the deists who historically believe that, there's a God, a God of some kind, but God is impersonal. God doesn't really care. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were deists. They believed very much that there was a God of some kind, but that God doesn't really involve himself. After the creation, it's like he takes a bowling ball and rolls it down the lane and listen, whatever happens to the universe is just going to happen to the universe. Well, Genesis 1 dispels the notion of deism right away and says, no, God creates and then God also commands. God creates and God also arranges. God orders. God very much cares how you use this thing. God very much cares that you see the point and the purpose behind why he made this. And you can see all of this especially in the creation of man. He didn't just create man and say, well, they're going to do what they're going to do now. I made you and I guess you're on your own now. No, he said, let us make man in our image. And he made man to be like him. He made man to be a moral being, a being with a will, a being with intellectual and decision-making capabilities, and a moral responsibility as well. And a relational being that would seek after, or like Acts chapter 17 says, to grope after their Creator, if perhaps they might find him. That we long to have a relationship with our Creator is baked into us. And Genesis 1 affirms this. Chaos is brought into order by the functions given by God. God does not merely create, which is a striking enough accomplishment as it is. No, God also creates purpose. Let me give you some examples. So we've already read here in these first few verses that God created light, but the light is sharply contrasted with darkness. God creates light and then says that light is what? That it's good. He gives a moral component to light. You ever think about that? We think of light in physics terms as just being photons going around through the universe doing their thing, right? That we view it merely as a scientific thing. But God created light and said, no, there's a moral component to this as well. I have created something that is good. Good is a moral term. It's good. And it's contrasted with darkness. Light is good, and darkness is not. And then you're going to see that in the rest of the Bible. There's a lot of places in the Bible, like John chapter 1, like the book of Revelation, where it talks about light and darkness being these moral things. John chapter 3, Jesus gets done talking to Nicodemus. And he says, John 3, verse 16, that God so loved the world. But, the reason why people don't love God in return, well, he goes on and says it's because people live in the darkness, and they love the darkness because their deeds are dark. Darkness is, morally speaking, a bad thing. Now, what that might say about literal physical light and darkness, I'm not sure that that's really what Genesis 1 is talking about here. It's not saying when you turn a light on in your living room that that's a morally good condition, or that when you turn the light off when you go to bed at night, God looks at it and says, well, that's bad now. No, it's saying that there is something ultimately good about the light that God gives to this universe. God gives light where darkness always existed. And we'll make a bigger point about that a little bit later on in the lesson. One more thing before we move on to the next thing God creates is, I think, again, in verses 1 through 5, what we're really looking at here is not as much an explanation of God created photons, which he did. Again, I absolutely affirm God created photons, but is Genesis 1 saying, and so God created photons? Now, I think really what he's saying is that God created the structure for time, really. I mean, when he says God made light, let there be light, and only a couple verses later he calls the light day, light and day are in this passage synonyms for each other. He called the light day, and he called the darkness night. And when you think about day and night, what do those things then represent? Well, they represent the basic building blocks of what we call time. I mean, even before seconds and hours or years on a calendar were formulated by culture and history and society and those sorts of things, before there were hours and days as we measure them, right, as these definite man-made measurements, how do you measure time? Day and night. Because, whether you're 5,000 years ago, or whether you're a Roman, or whether you're a Jew, or whether you have an atomic clock, what is one way that all of mankind, for all of human history, can understand the passage of time? Days and nights. And so when God creates light, he's not just creating photons, God is also creating the means for us to understand the passage of time. Next, God creates space. Now, I mean space not like the space above us, but I mean like space as in an environment for us to exist. He says in verse 6, then God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. Let it separate the waters from the waters. And so God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. And so it was. And God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and there was morning, a second day. One of the other great building blocks of life, human existence, is weather and our environment that surrounds us. And here God is creating the environment. It's not just saying God made clouds and God made the ocean, right? The raw materials were there. God is giving purpose and function to the raw materials by separating that, which is an act of God. That's a purposeful, intentional act of God to take raw materials and separate them from each other. I mean, again, that's what we might do if we were to build something, create something of our own. If we take a big pile of bricks, we separate those bricks and then arrange them in such a way as to create a structure of some kind. So here God is separating water from water and creating what New American Standard calls an expanse. But another way we might think of it is God is creating the setting for human existence, our environment. He's creating this grand terrarium that we may have a place to be. And that place is bound by the waters above it and the waters below it, our environment. And included in that would be things like weather, another one of the basic building blocks of human existence. On the third day, dry land appears. He says in verse 9, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, let the dry land appear. And so it was. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And so God also said in verse 11, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, fruit trees bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them on the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, trees bearing fruit with seeds in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning, a third day. And so he's created time and a way to measure it. He's created an environment for beings to exist. And now he's also providing the third great building block of life here on planet Earth, which is food. The means for growing food and gathering it together to consume. I mean, you think about the original audience to Genesis 1 were the Israelites. Moses presumably wrote Genesis while they were wandering in the wilderness for those 40 years. And what have the Israelites been exposed to for 40 years now? For hundreds of years before that in their slavery. Well, they have seen the cycle every single year of the Nile River flooding and then the Nile River receding. And as the Nile River recedes, what does it leave behind in the soil? It leaves behind sediment. And what do you do with sediment-rich soil? Lee knows that. They drive past it every single time they come to church across the river. Now, you got Memphis on one side of the river up on the bluff, but on the Arkansas side of the river, what's over there? It's kind of a weird thing, is it? You look on the Arkansas side and you go, there's not a lot of development over there, is there? My parents were wondering about that this last week when we were down by the river. Like, how come there's not more development? I said, well, that's because it floods every year. You don't want to build something over there because it floods every year. And on the Arkansas side of the river is actually some of the richest soil in all of North America because the Mississippi River floods and leaves behind sediment. So look at what's going on here. On the third day, God is taking the water and receding it and raising up dry land so that vegetables can grow on the dry land. Well, the Israelites just spent hundreds of years seeing that same thing in the Nile River. Now, I'm not in any way saying that this is just just God drawing a picture for them. I'm saying He did create it all as it's explained here. But it's a really neat thing here that in creating the earth and giving it function, God is saying, look at this precedent that I'm setting. Look at this cycle that I'm creating. And it's a cycle that you get to take advantage of for the rest of time to sustain life here on earth. To follow the seasons as they change. That there are tides, that there are rivers that overflow, and those rivers recede and those tides go back. And you're going to be able to harvest things from the water. You're going to harvest food and grow food in that soil. And so in these first 3 days, God has not just created raw materials. God creates raw material and then also lays down the basic functions of those things so that life as we know it can exist. In the first 3 days, God has created time, God has created environment, and God has created food. And if you think about what it is to be a life form on planet Earth, you need those 3 things. You are bound by those 3 things. Your entire life and its cycles also follow those 3 things: time, environment, and food. And it's interesting that when you go a little bit later in the book of Genesis, after the flood, look at the things that God says in His promise to Moses in Genesis chapter 8 and verse 22. While the earth remains, look at the things that He says here. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. That's those 3 things, but in reverse order. In Genesis 1, God created time, God created environment, and God created food. And now in His promise to Noah, after the flood, He flips it and He says, as long as the earth remains, you will have food, you will have environment, and you will have the passage of time. I just think it's really fascinating here that God is reaffirming from the creation account the first 3 days of creation and saying, all of those things and the functions that I've given them, I promise, those things will remain for you, and life on planet Earth will continue. I think that's a really, really neat thing there in Genesis chapter 8. Well, let's accelerate a little bit because I want to get to, now that we've looked at the environment and the function that we've given, I want to just look at these last few things and move on to the practical application here, okay? In these next few days in Genesis chapter 1, God also populates a well-ordered universe. He created time, He created environment, and He created food. So what's the only thing left now for God to create? Man. Well, and the animals as well, right? A population. Nobody buys a terrarium and sets it all up and then doesn't do anything with it. Right, Kyle? When I helped Kyle and Justin Stanko, Kyle has the biggest aquarium you've ever seen in your life. It is unimaginably huge, and he wanted help moving it. So we helped move it. But Kyle didn't set up this mat, and this aquarium, it's like a bus. I mean, it's like a school bus in his garage. You have any fish in there yet? 3? He's got 3 fish. He's got like the Atlanta aquarium in his garage, and he's got 3 fish in there. But so you're unproving my point then, because I was going to say nobody sets up a terrarium or an aquarium or something like that and then doesn't put anything in it. Like the whole point of setting that thing up and then putting the pebbles down and putting everything and putting the water in, the whole point is to populate it with something. And so in the next few days of creation, God populates it. Now, interestingly enough, he starts by populating the heavens with these heavenly bodies. Now, they're not, they're inanimate. We understand stars don't actually have will or anything like that. But it's interesting that when he looks up here, when we look up, we see a heaven that is populated by different bodies. The stars, the moon, and the sun. And look, God gives function to them as well. If you go back to Genesis chapter 1, God doesn't just create the stars and go, well, those are interesting looking. God creates the stars and says, I had a point behind that. There's a purpose behind that, bear in mind. In verse 14, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens, to, and what does that word to mean? It means for this reason. There are lights in the heavens for this reason. To separate the day from the night. And let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years, and let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth. There are multiple purposes then. He says, I'm going to put a bunch of lights up in the sky, okay? Stars, moon, sun. And I've got several different reasons for it. I didn't just give it to you to look at. Like, I didn't just buy it so that it can, have no purpose to it. I created it so that they can separate the day from the night. That's purpose number 1, separate the day from the night. Purpose number 2 is to be for signs, so that they indicate the passage of time and seasons and days and in years. And you'll be able to measure time, and you'll be able to kind of regulate, right, in some structure, the passage of time because of the movement of those heavenly bodies. And third, he says, I gave those things so that they may be lights to give light on the earth. And so in just 2 verses, he gives 3 different purposes and functions behind those things. Well, and then he also begins to populate the planet itself with fish and birds, and then the beasts of the field and all the crawling creatures here that we have on earth, in the sea, in the sky, and on land. And he gives a function to them as well, or he gives them a mission at least. There's a job to be fruitful and multiply, right? That's a commandment, isn't it? And we don't often think about it, but when God creates these things, he commands them, now be fruitful and multiply. That's a commandment. That's a mission that God gives them. Structure, order, purpose. And finally, he creates man. He creates man. And of course, to man, he gives the moral imperative to be like him in the use of his will and his morality. Even on the 7th day, it's interesting that even on the 7th day, as Genesis 2 points out, on a day of rest where God doesn't create anything new, even on the 7th day, God says there's still a purpose behind this. As he points out there in verses 1 through 3, especially here in verse 3, then God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. So even on a day of rest, God provides purpose, structure, and function. All right. You're wondering where we're going with this. That's okay. Genesis 1 and 2, the creation account, as I said before, is not just a technical explanation for, well, and then God made carbon, and then God made oxygen, and then God made uranium, and then God made sodium, and then he took some of these things and he put them together in this way, and he made this thing over here, and then he took some of these materials and he made this thing over here. It's not just a technical manual for the raw materials of the universe. This is actually a theological statement about who God is. Genesis 1 is not really about the creation. Genesis 1 is really about the Creator. It is about a God who takes things that are formless and void and useless and shapes them and commands them and orders them to become what they're meant to be by His will. And again, if you're reading Genesis 1 and all you see is God made cows, or if you're reading Genesis 1 and all you see is just raw material, then you've missed the grand first statement of theology in the Bible. And you've missed that Genesis 1 is also a little bit about you. Because as we go through the rest of the Bible, and don't worry, I'm not going to go through the rest of the Bible right now. We only have 5-10 minutes left here. But as you go through the rest of the Bible, the Bible is about God ordering and providing function and purpose to people. God takes people like Adam, and he places him in Genesis 2 in the garden, not just to sit around and eat grapes all day long and be lazy. He put him in the garden to cultivate it and to keep it. And God also gave him a moral framework in the garden, that there were commandments and moral expectations for Adam in the garden. God takes somebody like Abraham or Jacob or Moses or Rahab or Gideon or David and takes them from lives of untapped potential. I mean, you think about Abraham. I mean, what was Abraham doing for the first 80 years of his life? Well, Genesis says nothing that needs to be reported on, right? For the first 80 years of his life, like, well, what do we know about Abraham? And the Bible says, nothing that matters. Abraham didn't start doing the most important things of his life until he was an old man. Same with Moses. You know, we don't really know a ton about Moses. We know about his birth and a little bit about his upbringing. And then for 40 years, he's just kind of untapped raw material in the land of the Midianites. Doing what? He's just a shepherd. And we don't know anything about his life. Essentially, we don't know anything about his life until God takes him as an 80-year-old man and says, you're an 80-year-old man and you have not yet begun the greatest adventure of your life. And all these other characters, Rahab was a prostitute. Gideon. God looks at Gideon and speaks to the angel and says, that's a valiant warrior right there. And Gideon's like, who, me? Yeah, you. You're a valiant warrior. You just don't know it yet. You just don't know it yet. And of course, with the disciples, I want to go back and just talk about those fishers of men real quick. God found these fishermen in Galilee, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and they're just fishing. They're just fishing. Just making a living, being fishers. And Jesus says, I've got something more important for you to be doing. Follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men. Like the formless and void raw material in the beginning in Genesis 1, God sees your life as a great bank of untapped potential. He sees you caught in a cycle of vanity and emptiness, pathetically wandering from one diversion to the next here on planet Earth. I had a great conversation just on Wednesday night with one of our members. And I asked her, well, hey, Happy New Year. How's your New Year starting? And she said, you know what? It's starting really, really well. Because I had an awakening last night. And I said, well, do you mind if I pry and ask what you mean by that? And she said, you know, I've been a Christian for a while now. And I just feel like I've gone through the motions all these years. And I come and I sit and I do the part and I'm a good person and I try to obey the commandments, but I've just always felt like I'm just sort of floating, wandering. And I decided no longer. No longer. And so I prayed and I prayed and I prayed like I've never prayed before. And I opened up my scriptures and I started reading like I've never read before. And I decided that this was going to be the year that I really devoted myself, gave myself. You know what that is? God found raw material and said, you will be formless and void no longer. That's what that is. And I hope that all of us can have an awakening like that. We sit in a pew, and what are we doing the rest of the time? Sometimes it feels like going to church, for lack of a better term, sometimes it feels like going to church itself is that moment in a roller coaster where you're at the bottom of the roller coaster. And it's just tink, 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 tink. And we lose all this momentum where it should be worshiping God should be the most exciting thing. Being around God's people should be the energy that we have to get through the rest of the week. We should be looking forward to Monday, not because we have to go to work. We should be looking forward to Monday because that's when we get to strap our armor on and get out there and do the work that God wants us to be doing. You are raw, untapped potential sitting there doing nothing. And me too. Far too often I find myself formless and void. Yes, God created me. But you know what else He did? He created me to be something. He created me with function as well as form. Yes, Psalm 139. Yes, look at the creation. Look at our hands, our eyes, our brains, these amazing things. You know why God made it that way? He didn't make the brain and go, well, that's a great computer right there. I wonder what they're going to do with it. You know what we do with it? That is not why God made your brain. That is not why God made you smart. You have all this potential. But like the one-talent man burying it in the ground, he said, well, I didn't lose any of it for you, God. And even after becoming Christians, maybe you still find yourself without aim. It reminds me of the rich young ruler in Matthew chapter 19. I think we all can identify with the rich young ruler. A lot of people, American Christians in the 21st century, we are prosperous, comfortable. We have a lot in the pantry and a lot in the bank. Maybe it doesn't always feel that way, right? But compared to most people in the world, you're a very, very materially blessed person. Every one of us in this room is materially very blessed in the grand scheme of things and relative to human history. And so like the rich young ruler, we come to God and say, all right, I'm doing all the stuff. What do I need to do to go to heaven? And God says, well, what do the scriptures say? What are you commanded to do? Well, I don't murder anybody. I got that one taken care of. I have never murdered anybody. Well, I don't commit adultery. Never done that before. I'm nice to my mom and dad. And yet, like the rich young ruler, I think, and in that conversation that I had with one of our members on Wednesday night, I think we still look at that and go, but what am I still lacking? Because if I go to church and I'm a good moral person and I'm checking all the boxes, why do I still feel useless to God? And the rich young ruler said, what am I still missing? You know what he was missing? You got to give everything up and make your entire life about Jesus. That's what he was, is that all? Yeah, that's all. Because until you do that, all you are is just formless and void, waiting around for something that God has already offered to do to you. Now, if you can believe it, I actually have like 8 more slides, and this is going to make a really, really good part 2 next Sunday. So hold on, there's a lot more practical application because in the rest of the lesson, which will become a part 2, I actually am going to go through, well, what does this actually look like? What does it mean day to day in my life to become shaped and molded and given purpose and function by God to do more and to be fully utilized the way that He created the universe and ordered it? God can do the same thing in your life. So please come back next Sunday, and I promise I'll finish this lesson. But for now, let's go ahead and pray to God, and we'll be dismissed to our Bible classes. Our Heavenly Father,